And hello YouTube, this is Thomas Judge back once again with another YouTube reading guide series. Today is the sixth video of a series of 10 videos that are walking through the often overlooked DC annual events, which are published by the comic publisher DC throughout the 90s. To create this reading guide, I've read the several hundred issues that comprise all the DC annual events over that decade, and I've used that knowledge to put together this video series. No further ado, let's dive into it. Today we're looking at the DC annual event from 1996, which is the DC annual event called Legends of the Dead Earth. Now, I'll show you this page here. This is the first page when you open any of these annual events, and it kind of summarizes it pretty well. The premise or the theme here for this year's annual event was Earth is dead. Dramatic, I know. Those who once might have called it home are long scattered to the endless stars. But in that scattering on 1,000 different worlds by 1,000 different ways, Earth's greatest legends live on. In other words, Legends of the Dead Earth was a large crossover spanning through all of DC's annuals throughout the whole of 1996. It features stories about a possible future of the universe, so they're all set in the future, in which the planet Earth itself had essentially been died or exterminated or destroyed, and all of its heroes were gone. However, the heroes had still left an impression on both human and alien culture, and their stories and legends were still being passed down in various ways. Now, some of these legends, as it turns out in some of these random issues, were actually being spread around the universe by Martian Manhunter, who was still alive in the future in some of these variant universes. Now, I think I should point out what I mean by that. This isn't all set as one single in continuity idea, and I found that quite disappointing. Um, it was essentially a bit of a disappointment that there was no single unifying future disaster or idea that was being destroyed. It wasn't as if all of these issues were set, say, 30,000 years in the future, and they were looking back upon the Earth, and they were all referencing and looking at different aspects of the same invasion or villain or antagonist or crisis. That wasn't the case. They were all set at random times, which I'll discuss in a second, and were random scenarios, which I'll discuss in a second. And what that means that functionally, this entire event, all the issues in this event, ended up just being fantasy Elseworlds. So let's jump into it. Given none of them are linked and they're all standalone, we'll just do this in pretty much alphabetical order. So let's start off with Action Comics, Annual 8. This was set 1,000 years in the future, and it stars Bizarro in this weird kind of circus pastiche of P.T. Barnum's Circus, I guess. It was a bit strange. Next up, we had Adventures of Superman Annual 8. This was set 500,000 years in the future, so you see what I mean about none of these being linked or unified. This issue is about an alien that gets inspired by the legend of Superman. Technically, and this is an Easter egg, so don't worry if you don't get it, he's actually inspired by the automated recording featured at the end of Man of Steel Annual 4, which was in my last video because it was one of the 1995 annuals. That's very much a subtle Easter egg that I only expect people to notice if they read them relatively close together, as I did, but just thought I'd mention that. Next up, we have Aquaman Annual number 2. This was written by Peter David and features two Aquaman stories within a larger framing narrative. Azrael Annual 2 is just a fantasy Elseworlds that has, like, for example, it has Bane as an ogre, etc., etc. Like, nothing too exciting about it. Batman Annual 20 is by Doug Mensch. It starts off as kind of a fantasy Elseworld, but then kind of reveals itself as being like a high-tech future dystopia, a random Elseworld story again. Then we have Batman Legends of the Dark Knight Annual 6. This is about a world where a human spaceship called the Pride of Gotham crashed 500 years prior to the story on an alien planet, leaving a few survivors. This story is set on that alien planet with the society that arose 500 years after this ship crashed, and it revolves around someone called Kathy Kane, who is Batwoman. The next issue is Batman Shadow of the Bat Annual 4, which is a pretty cool cover of Batman riding a dinosaur. This story is told by someone who is 33 billion years in the future and is essentially telling a historical story of a time when there was a far-reaching, universe-spanning human empire. And the story itself is about a Batman who is the 23rd generation descended from Bruce Wayne himself. By the way, if all these sound really random, that's because they are. They're all disconnected and utterly random. Some of them are good, some of them are bad. Okay, anyway, moving on. Catwoman Annual number 3. So this is framed by the guide for an alien space museum, like a tour guide, who's telling the story of Gotham, but getting it all backwards. So it's kind of funny. They're telling a story where Riddler and Joker are heroes, and Batwoman and Catwoman are married to each other, and they're thieves, and they're murderers that have a cat cave and a catmobile. It's kind of goofy and weird. Next up, we have Detective Comics Annual 9, written by Chuck Dixon. So this is set in the world of Typhon, which I'd never heard of before, and this orbits the stars Isis and Osiris. And this is a story basically where some kids find a lost warbot robot, some kind of military robot, from an interstellar war that was 2,000 years prior to the events of the comic itself. Next up, we have Flash Annual 9, written by Peter Tomasi. This is set on a future Earth that's been destroyed by environmental disasters. Now, the Martian Manhunter has passed the Book of Iris, as in Flash's partner, to the surviving humans, which has led to the cult of the Lightning, or Flash, being established. It's actually a pretty cool story. Green Lantern Annual 5. This is just two unrelated stories of Green Lanterns from alien races, written by Chuck Dixon and Len Wein, respectively. Next up, we have Guy Gardner, Warrior, Annual number 2. First things first, the very first page when you open this depicts this story as being Chapter 2. There is no Chapter 1. Don't worry about that. You haven't missed that out. Essentially, they're just calling it Chapter 2 as kind of a spoof of the Star Wars opening scroll, so don't worry about that. The story itself is an alien theme park where guests enjoy virtual reality simulations of Guy Gardner's life. It's basically 4 mini stories put together, essentially. Next up, we have Impulse Annual number 1. This is set on the planet called something like Matonkaf or something like that. It was weird to pronounce, which was colonized by humans who crash landed there 100 years earlier, and which was then occupied by the alien Dargonian Empire, which I'd never heard of. The main character is basically really annoying, but he has super speed. It's a rubbish story. It has no mention of the Flash, no mention of Bart Allen. Yeah, I didn't enjoy this. Justice League of America Annual number 10 was written by Chris Priest. The story is Captain Atom and Max Lord specific, set in a far future, and it's actually pretty good. Legionnaires Annual 3, written by Roger Stern with art from Dan Jurgens. The story revolves around the speedster X5 and essentially her bouncing around the time stream. Now, I know very little about Legionnaires or Legion of Superheroes, but I do know that X5 is kind of a known superhero, so I guess it makes sense with all the time travel stuff. The majority of the story actually takes place in the 100th century. In case you're wondering, Legion of Superheroes are normally set in the 30th century, and most of the story is set on a different planet anyway. Speaking of Legion of Superheroes, Annual 7 stars the character of Wildfire as the last Legionnaire, and he explicitly references the Legends of a Dead Earth. In a rare turn, at least for my opinion of Legion of Superheroes, this was actually a coherent story, but it just wasn't a good one. The Power of Shazam Annual 1. So it was written by Jerry Ordway and set on a planet called Bindaran, I think. It features a teenage girl who gets the power of Shazam and then gets taught the ropes by an old Captain Marvel. Sorry, an old Shazam. Moving on, Robin Annual number 5, written by Chuck Dixon. This is a sci-fi setting, tens of thousands of years in the future. Vague, I know, but that's all it says. And it also features a new Batman we haven't seen previously. Sovereign 7, Annual number 2. I know nothing about the Sovereign 7 series, and this annual did not make me keen to check it out and read any more. It's written by Chris Claremont, who I do normally like, and this starts off very strong, with the narrator observing the literal end of the universe. But it then gets muddled, it then gets messy, and it then gets weird and confusing. Starman Annual 1. This is written by James Robinson. The overall framing of this is on another planet in the future and consists of 2 distinct stories being narrated by the framing speaker. The first story is on another planet, but still in our future, and the other story is actually a story about classic Starman in the contemporary era on Earth. Superboy Annual 3. This has a very strong Aztec theme and set of motifs. It's set on an alien planet and it's about a future dynasty of superpowered people, not necessarily Kryptonians, just people with superpowers, who are trying to uphold the legacy of the original Superman. Supergirl Annual 1. This is actually three self-contained stories in one issue. The first is written by Chuck Dixon and reminded me quite a lot of the film Avatar. The second is set in a spaceship and is more about the myth of Supergirl, whilst the third is a weird Wild West themed ice planet, which is an odd combination in and of itself. Superman Annual number 8. This was written by David Michelini and it's about the League of Supermen, which is a team of Supermen that all work together because they only have one superpower each. So, for example, one of them can fly, one of them is strong, one of them has laser vision, that sort of stuff. It's a weird idea, interesting. Almost at the end now. Superman Man of Steel Annual number 5, set in the future where there is an evil space empire. It has like a brand new Superman, as is pretty much usual for this year's worth of stories. But randomly, it features the 60th generation's descendant of Lex Luthor, which is weird. And very much finally, Wonder Woman Annual number 5, written by John Byrne. This is an excellent story. I really, really enjoyed this about a generational world ship. If you want to know what a world ship is the idea of a ship that can't go faster than light. So if you send it off to another solar system, you have to have people on there who are going to live, have families, die, their kids will grow up, live, have families, die, and so on. So several generations will pass on the ship before it gets to where it's going. That's the premise here, and it's really, really interesting. You can see that DC fandom, as usual, lists them all as follows. So there's a screenshot if you want it. But otherwise, yeah, Legend of the Dead Earth, it had some good ones, it had some bad ones. Overall, it was a missed opportunity. Um, yeah, I do wonder what would happen if people revisited this idea now and did it with a bit more coherency and a bit more editorial oversight. But there we have it. All right, thanks for watching, everybody. As always, please like, comment, subscribe. As always, please follow me on Twitter at I am Thomas Judge, where I will post a daily review of whatever comics I've been reading. You can get an idea of what I'm up to on the channel. And as always, please support the channel by heading over to Amazon.com and checking out my prose novel about superheroes. It's a completely original piece of work. The first episode in it is called Arrivals, and the series as a whole is called No Gods or Kings. You can find an excerpt of that on my website, nogodsorkings.com. Until next time, everybody, stay classy.